I was gifted this beautiful palette from Pottery by Eleni. It's inspired by an oyster shell and it's got a beautiful iridescent shimmer to it. So I thought it'd be really, really fun to use it to paint an oyster shell. You'll find details of the supplies I'm using down below the video, and there's also a link to a reference photo, or of course you can grab a shell of your own. So let's get our paints and get painting. I'm sketching out in pencil today. I'm using Fabriano Artistico Cold Press paper. This is 300 GSM, 140 pounds. And I've just used some Pro masking tape, which is a cream artist masking tape, to just sort of square off an area of my paper. Doesn't really matter where I start drawing. I'm choosing the left edge. I'm right-handed, so I'm working left to right. If you're left-handed, it might be more intuitive to start on the other side, so you're not bringing your hand over the drawing. And then I'm just sketching the broad outline of the oyster shell. And I'm sort of going from side to side almost, just to help me even up the points in the drawing, so I can kind of compare, you know, what's going on in the top to what shapes I can see in the bottom. I'm looking kind of at the outline, the very, very outside of it. If you find that sort of tricky to discern, just going to go inside a bit there. You might find that putting a bright coloured piece of paper or card behind it might make it more obvious for you. Of course, one of the wonderful things about these lovely irregular shaped oyster shells is if it does go a bit wonky, no one's going to notice. Just go with it. Okay, and then I'm just very lightly going to sketch in sort of some of the main contours and features. So I've already got the little nook groove up there. This is where I can see a little bit of the bottom of the shell. There's a bit of shadow there. And I don't want my lines to be too hard and obvious. There's all these beautiful wiggly lines here. I think I'm going to leave those to try and do in paint. And then these contours are all quite gentle, so just making very light marks that I can erase down the way just to kind of remind me where things are when I come to paint. If you're feeling very brave, you can just sketch in the outside and leave the rest. Okay, I think that is all the information I need. It's pretty bare, but we'll work things up as we go. Okay, so I'm making this a very weak watery wash. And then I'm just looking at my shell for where I can see areas that are almost purely yellow. And I'm painting wet on dry at the moment. These are kind of going to be little highlights. Don't need to get too fussy. Okay, I think that will do. So really just gently kissed a few areas. Then I'm going to take some of my Dioxazine Purple and mix it in with my ochre. Now, one of the advantages of masking off like this, I can just use the top just to check I've got the colour I want. I think I want that to be more purple. Again, this is very light, very washy. I want something in between those two. One advantage of a big palette like this is I have tons of mixing space. Okay, I'm going to err towards the purple side there. And then hopefully, it's a pretty hot day today, but my yellow should still be wet. I'm just painting in some of those shadow spots. I'm looking for where there's kind of little highlights of light. And I'm trying to leave those white. And I'm looking for sort of some of the main directions of grooves in the shell. If you find yourself getting lost, then just squint a bit. And that will help you kind of figure out those lights and darks. I think I'm going to leave most of that area there. There's a bit of shadow down there. There's a lot of shadow here, but I think that's going to be more of the pure purple. Tiny bit of shadow up at the top there. And again, I'm just trying to keep it loose. A bit more of my dioxazine ochre mix. Kind of a shadow area there. Just helps me build up the contour of the shell. And then in here is in shadow. Of course, one of the tricky bits of painting on the boat is my light does tend to change as the boat swings around on anchor. Then a little bit of burnt sienna, a reasonable amount of my dioxazine. Tester up there. That's going to be a lovely colour for that purple area in the middle there. Getting more sort of pure dioxazine, and I think that's going to be nice for this lower shadow. And I'll bring it round into that bottom right. And then up here as well. If I keep squinting, I can see where the shadows are darkest. Of course, the darkest part of all is this bowl in the middle. And with my dioxazine again, I'm just using little flicks to help start getting the feeling of the grooves in there. And we'll be building this up over time. And a little more of that dioxazine dropped in there. Okay, it's quite a dark groove there. And I'm just going to paint in that groove on top and add wet and wet, a bit more shadow down the bottom. You can see how the colours just kind of flow together, so it's giving it a natural sort of an edge. Pick up a bit of the sienna, wet and wet again, and just drop it in on the top there. Okay, so I'm picking up a bit of my ochre. I want some neutrals for the middle section there. And some of that dioxazine. And take a little bit of going backwards and forwards to get the colour right. A little more purpley than I want. But these mixes are definitely thicker than what I was using earlier, which was really watery. This is sort of a thick tea, I guess, rather than a thin tea. There's sort of some yellowy patches in there that I want to catch as well. Sort of prepping all my colours because I want everything to, it's going to be a bit of wet and wet where I'm going to let it run together. So let's get those lightest yellows down first. And there's kind of a curved direction, so I'm just letting my brush strokes follow that. Okay, then there's this really interesting bruised kind of a colour. I'm just going to let it flow into that ochre there as well. And then this is just water on my brush. I'm just touching the outside of that line, just to soften it a little. See, it's kind of smudgy in the shell there. This is that ochre and dioxazine again. I'm adding in some of the shapes and shadows I can see here. And then just with thin lines, adding some of those curves. So trying to get this a little bit darker. Dioxazine, natural sienna. Okay, you see this mix, if I draw lines through it, they're staying put a little bit longer. So this is just a little thicker. A little bit more yellowy area. And then a more purpley patch. And then just going to draw in some of these fine lines there. So trying to do it all in one stroke. They don't look too sketchy. Filling in the contours. Because of the way they've been worn away, they're not totally even, so it doesn't matter if I let them touch. You know, some are thicker than others. There are some gaps. It's definitely less definition there. I'm going to pull some of that colour down into the very base of the shell as well. Let's get some more of that purple and drop it in. That's kind of the very base area. Just wipe my brush on the palette to lighten it up again. A couple of knocks down here. Then, yeah, sort of more shadow up here than I've shown. You know, it's easier to build up the colour and make it darker than it is to lighten it. So if in doubt, then stop and let your paint dry. I'm just going over here with the dioxazine mix. We'll let that dry for a minute while this bit of light comes over. Okay, and then before that dries too much, just going to wash this area there just to get that sort of shadowy curve. And then this is just a bit more detail, kind of following those stripes I put in earlier. Paint on my brush is gradually getting lighter. I keep looking back and trying to spot where those areas of light are and keep them reserved. And then for my last pass, I'm going to put in the darkest shadow. So just holding my painting up to the light to see if the paint is dry. You'll often see a little sheen if it isn't. And that's looking pretty good. So dioxazine, burnt sienna. Feel like that kind of stronger colour on the edge has got lost. So just a very thin strip of water. Then I'm drying off my brush. I think I want that to be thicker actually. Nothing here is going to become a very dark colour. And I'm just kind of skipping my brush across. So these look like sort of smudgy dots. And you see the darker consistency, I'm getting much thicker coverage there. And then my dioxazine and ochre. Again, I'm making this mix a lot thicker. I can try it up here. That's more brown than I want, so it needs more of the dioxazine. And again, if I kind of draw my brush through it now, you see how the lines are not moving much. So this is a thicker mixture. I can test it up here too. Good. Okay. I'm just putting some of those darker details in the middle. Trying to keep my brush strokes loose. This comes with practice, and trying not to overwork it at this stage. Just wiping my brush against the palette and kind of twisting it as I do it, which kind of helps reform the point. I just want a couple of very fine lines. What's going to happen is then it will sort of translate the dark from here through to here. And you notice I didn't dip my brush in the water, so my colour is still thick. And then I want to be kind of careful now. I don't want anything to get as dark as this, but I'm just sort of squinting at my shell again, looking for any dark cracks that just need a little bit more refining. This is the time in the painting when I'm trying to be careful. I don't want to overwork it. I'm certainly not going to get every little nuance in, but sometimes just these last few little details. Yes, you see a little patch of shadow there. So I'm just going over the lines in that area, and that should just make that pop a little bit more. Same down here. This is lacking dimension a little bit. It's a little dark. I'm just softening it with a bit of water. And a bit more pigment for this bit. And then my dioxazine ochre mix. And just a few gentle strokes up here. Trying to make sure I reserve my whites. Looking for where those real light patches of light are. Don't want it to be quite that dark for over here. Just adding a few of those chips in the shell that help to add dimension. Again, line of colour, just softening that edge a bit. I can just keep drawing that paint up a little.
There's kind of a bit of movement there. Okay, and then the last thing we need is a drop shadow, which should give a little bit of extra dimension by showing where our shell fits in the paper. So starting off with dioxazine for this. And the darkest parts of the shadow are right under the shell. I'm going to add a bit of Sienna in there, I think. To warm it up. And actually, it looks like there's a tiny bit of backlighting. Sort of want a lighter mix of that colour. And then bringing a bit more of the dioxazine into it to cool it down. And we'll let that dry for a second, then we'll add some more layers to it. Okay, I want another dark shadow area. So I'm using colours that are in the painting rather than just adding grey. It makes everything feel a lot more homogeneous. Keeps everything working together. My first shadow area isn't quite dry, but I'm going in with a thicker mix. It's another sort of coffee kind of consistency. So all that's going to do is sort of soften the edges. This might be a bit wet to work into, so I might stop there. You see it's kind of smudging. I'm going to end up with mud otherwise. And while I'm waiting for that to dry, up here the only things I have indicating the edge of my shell are my pencil lines. So I'm going to mix up some very, very light ochre. There aren't many areas where there's just ochre. And then just painting on a wet wash. I'm going to need to turn that round. I'm using my big brush so I can get some large strokes in. I'm going to get some water on my brush. I'm just going to tip the paper. We're just going to have a bit of a gradated wash here. Just pulling the paint to the edge. And then I'll pull a dry brush along the edge just to make sure I haven't got any beads of water that will then create backflows, although that could create an interesting texture as well. Okay, then I'm going to tip this up to the light. You see there's still a sheen on this area, which means it's still wet, but I'm not seeing a sheen on my shadow. So we're going to go, I don't want much water on my brush because I can still get backflows. So I just rinse my brush off. Oh, that's the wrong color, isn't it? Okay, try that again. I'm just, I have a little kind of rag here I'm just blotting my brush on. I'm just out of shot. I don't want to introduce a lot of water in here because it's dry, but, or dry-ish. There's no longer a sheen, but I don't want to get backgrounds. We're getting a nice thick mix, so that's I was using burnt sienna and dioxazine. Bring back my model here, so I've got some of my darker shadow areas underneath here. Because I've got light coming from different areas, there's sort of different qualities of value in the shadow. Yeah, you see, because it's just a little bit damp, it's just smudging a little bit, but that's just going to soften the lines. If I wanted a really hard line, I could leave it longer. But it should be dry enough that I'm not going to get any blots or backflows. It's just helping give a little bit of extra dimension. Trying not to play with it and pick at it too much, but just to get the definition on that bottom side. You know, the less we go over an area with our brush, the better it will be. And I'm thinking I'm just about done here, being super picky. I think my shadow there, let's get a bit more of my dioxazine. I have sort of a shadow here that is a bit darker on the shell than in my model. Actually, I think I want a bigger brush. So this is dioxazine and ochre, quite a light wash. I'm just going to go over that shadow area again. And I'm just leaving a highlight there. And bringing it up the side. Just look for where you can see the contours. Okay. Don't want to overwork it. I want to keep my colours light and crisp. I've still got some highlight areas. I'm pretty happy with the sienna. It's just bringing out the white where my highlights are on the shell there. Pretty content with my shadows. They're sort of adding, you know, a little bit of warmth to the picture. They're lifting the shell off the base as well. So I think I'm going to leave it there for the moment. And now, of course, the fun bit, the tape peel.